Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live, what does healthy disagreement in the workplace look like? And has it gotten harder in the age of telecommuting? We'll speak to a renowned expert on business relationships about releasing buried talent that's undervalued and unrewarded simply because it's unconventional. That and our poll coming up. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's Monday, October 12th. Happy Monday. And here's a quick look at the top stories that are trending right now on LinkedIn. The stalemate over the stimulus bill continues. Congress failed yet again to come to an agreement on another stimulus bill to support unemployed workers. Since passing the $2 trillion CARES Act in March, Congress hasn't agreed on what additional support will look like. Meanwhile, more than 800,000 Americans filed for jobless claims just last week. And a surge in coronavirus cases in New York City is causing authorities to crack down on large gatherings and non-essential businesses. Over $150,000 in fines were issued over the weekend to people and business owners who didn't abide by new restrictions of mask wearing, social distancing, and gatherings. Meanwhile, a new study out by MIT shows that Black Americans pay more than their white counterparts to own a home. That curbs their ability to build wealth as Black Americans pay more in mortgage interest, insurance, and property taxes. The report comes out just days after JP Morgan announced a $30 billion program to address the racial wealth gap in this country. For more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed, or if you're in mobile, be sure to click into the search box. That brings us to the poll that we have for you today. We've been polling members on the LinkedIn news page about disagreements in the workplace. Is it harder to resolve workplace conflicts while working remotely? Yes, it's more challenging, A. B, no, not at all. Maybe you find this easier to do remotely. Or C, it depends. Vote now in the stream, but also let us know your thoughts behind your vote. We'll have a conversation about that on today's show. Dealing with uncertainty is something that every worker, regardless of your profession, has gotten very used to during this pandemic. But of course, some are better at doing this than others. So how can we best navigate your career when the next day, much less the next year, is full of unknowns? Joining us now is management expert Margaret Heffernan. She is the author of the recently released book, Uncharted: How to Navigate the Future. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's really nice to be here.
Margaret, so I want to talk to you about predictions and our addiction to knowing what's going to happen next. Why is that failing us, particularly during this pandemic?
Well, it's failing us for a number of reasons. I mean, the first is that, to do predictions, you have models. Models always leave information out because otherwise the model would be as big as the world itself. And it often turns out that what you leave out is the stuff that mattered most. In particular, we have a belief that history repeats itself. As soon as the coronavirus epidemic began, people started talking about the 1918 epidemic. The truth is there isn't that much we can learn from it because this is a very, very different world, surprise, surprise, from 1918. So we don't actually have a data set that tells us much about where we are today. And you can see this in COVID, obviously, that we're getting more and more data all the time. And actually, it's becoming more and more confusing. So that means it's very hard to find the principles from which to extract a notion of the future. And also, we don't know of all that data, which is the important stuff and which is really noise. In addition, a lot depends on things like climate and personality and diet and all sorts of things. So there is never enough data about the future to be able to see what it really is.
But there's a comfort in thinking that history repeats itself. There's something about that just makes you feel a little bit better, particularly during uncertain times like this. In lieu of relying on historic events to predict what's going to happen next, how can we get comfort in other places when things are so uncertain like they are right now?
Well, I think the main thing is to think of certain uncertainty, not so much as a lack of certainty, but an excess of opportunity. Now, that may sound, kind of wildly optimistic, but the truth is that if you don't know the future, what that means is you have choices. And I think one of the things that's so dangerous about the myth that history repeats itself is that it suggests that certain outcomes are inevitable, which means you have no choices and you have no agency. You're just kind of flotsam on the stream of life, being pushed by other forces that you don't recognize. So uncertainty means that there are all kinds of things in play, and it's really up to you to navigate to the destinations that you seek and to make happen the things that you want to happen. So in many ways, I think my book is a kind of activist charter in terms of arguing that it is for us to make the world that we want. It is for us to make the careers that we want. It is for us to build the kinds of companies that we want. And while the kind of dominant myth at the moment, which is this is all inevitable, that we are just data, that somebody somewhere has it all figured out. I mean, I think it's dangerous because it makes people very, very passive. And it also suggests that you don't have options, whereas in fact, you always have options.
I love the authority behind that message, particularly now when people feel like they're just aimless. I'm going to go ahead and say hello to some members who are joining us in the stream. Martha from Los Angeles, Susan from Atlanta, Peter from Pennsylvania, Dolores from Texas, and Robert from Miami. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn News Live. I'm here with Margaret Heffernan. We're discussing her new book, Uncharted. Margaret, I love, one of the messages from your book that I loved is that optimism is key to navigating uncertainty. It's really hard to be optimistic right now, but why is that so important right now?
Well, it is really interesting because, I mean, I'm an optimist. The book is a very optimistic book. Optimists tend to do better in life, and they tend to do better in life for several reasons. One is they absolutely know that if things are bad, as they mostly are at the moment, that they're not going to last forever. They also understand that things might be better somewhere else, so that the moment that they are in is not the only moment that there can be. And also because optimists believe in their own agency, they take steps to address creatively the situation in which they find themselves. So they're much more active in creating their own lives instead of being pushed around by fads or pushy parents or pushy bosses or pushy partners.
And you, of course, started writing and researching this book before the pandemic began. Good on you, by the way, to come out with a book on uncertainty during this global pandemic. But how does you experiencing this pandemic yourself change how you think about this topic overall?
Well, I would certainly have to say that I have a much more visceral understanding of uncertainty now than I did before. I would also say that I do keep thinking, this is not going to last forever. And there are better ways of working and living through it. And so I'm constantly thinking about, okay, last week wasn't that bad. What can I do to make it better? Last week, I went into London to do a whole series of face-to-face meetings because I thought I can do this. I have the freedom to do it. I know how to do it safely. They were exhilarating meetings. Almost everybody I met with, it was their first face-to-face meeting for some time. And the consequence of that was we had very, very much longer, deeper conversations. So I think optimism gives you a sense of agency, that you have possibilities. It's up to you to make of the present what you can. And once you believe that, you find the opportunities. And once you find the opportunities, real relationships start to develop, and that's when all kinds of things become possible. As long as you're mired in the past, then you're just stuck.
That's true. I'm seeing a question in the stream right now from Sue. She wants to know, is optimism genetic or can you develop it?
It isn't genetic. Obviously, the kind of upbringing that you had in your family makes a very big difference. It's quite interesting. I'm quite an optimist. My sister is quite a pessimist. Did we have the same upbringing? We actually probably didn't, same household, same parent. She's first child, I'm second child. So our experience of life, I think, was quite different. We're quite different people. But I think, yes, you can develop it partly by spending more time with more optimistic people. And also by thinking back about the things you've done that made you feel good, made you productive, led to things that turned out to be very productive. It's quite interesting, I think, that we often analyze much more rigorously our failures than our success. And I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine a couple of years ago where we were trying to figure out why we'd had our best year ever. And the conclusion we came to was quite strange, which is we realized all of our greatest opportunities had come to us from people much junior to ourselves. And we thought that had happened because we both are very democratic in the way we treat people and often are quite attentive to younger people. And they're quite grateful and they remember us, surprisingly enough, because they don't get overlooked. So that's quite a useful thing to identify as a strength, which if you didn't think about it, you might overlook. So I think, tending instead of always kind of scratching at the failure, really trying to analyze in some practical way, why did this work, is a very productive activity. And it's not, it can sound kind of narcissistic and self-congratulatory, but it's really saying, well, why was this? What could I learn from it that I should do more of?
I'm definitely taking some mental notes right now. I tend to scratch at all of my failures instead of doing what you're saying to do right now.
I think women do that in particular. I think women do that a lot.
Andrea says, optimism is a sport. The more that you practice it, the better that you get at it. So Andrea, thanks for adding that to our conversation. Margaret, you mentioned going into London for some in-person meetings for the first time. But of course, a lot of us are still working remotely, which makes disagreeing really hard to do. I don't remember the last time I had a disagreement with one of my colleagues during this virtual world that we now live in. I actually want to bring up a quote from one of your recent TED Talks on this topic. You said, "My job is to prove Alice wrong." George said, "It was only by not being able to prove that she was wrong that George could give Alice the confidence she needed to know that she was right." You're referring to two colleagues in the medical profession having to disagree with each other. Why is disagreement so important right now in the workplace?
I think it's really important for several reasons. One is if you can work with somebody that really challenges you, it makes your work better. And that's what Alice Stewart said about George, that his skepticism, but also the fact that he thought very differently from Alice, meant that her argument was very, very much more rigorous. I mean, it's interesting you bring this up because I had a very, very fierce argument with my mother-in-law on Friday. And, the result of that was I went back and I checked my facts. And I went back and I dug up some research. And actually, we argue quite a lot, but in a friendly way. Actually, she made my case stronger because of the questions that she asked. And while I think it's obviously quite important to do this in a relatively cordial way, if you can, I think really a good argument is a kind of gift, because if you're willing to invest the time and effort in challenging somebody, it shows you think their work matters. It shows that you care about them, that you're not just going to say, yeah, good job, terrific, which is kind of lazy and not caring. But I think when I think of the people I have worked with in my career and learned the most from and got the most from, they were people who were not afraid of me and who could always say, I'm not sure about this, or I wonder if there's a better way to do that. Or, that bit's kind of okay, but it's a bit squishy. Could we come up with a different solution to that? And this is always how ideas get better. That there's this kind of myth, that ideas are born sort of fully fledged as brilliant. And the reality is that most great ideas start off as kind of crappy ideas, and then people add a bit and take out a bit and scrabble around it a bit. And it goes from kind of not very good to okay, from okay to kind of interesting, from kind of interesting to, wow, that's it. But it's a process where you need other people who will not settle for second best. And those are the colleagues you really cherish.
Right. The process requires other people giving you feedback. I'm actually going to go ahead and bring up the poll that we have for the members in the stream while we're discussing disagreements. Do you think it's harder to resolve workplace conflicts while working remotely? A, yes, it's more challenging. B, no, not at all. Or C, it depends. Vote now in the stream. We'll reveal the results of the poll at the end of today's show. Margaret, you talk about a disagreement you had with your mother-in-law over the weekend, but people within organizations, people working in companies, they often have the hardest time disagreeing. Why is that?
Well, what the research says is there are really two reasons. One is fear. Most people are conflict averse. They're afraid of starting an argument. They're afraid they'll lose control of it and they might end up looking stupid. And the second is futility, which is they feel, well, I could raise an issue or raise a challenge, but it's not going to make any difference, so why bother? And, in a previous book, Willful Blindness, I argue that this is exactly why very often when people can see things going wrong at work, and everybody can see it, nobody will say anything because they're so afraid of the argument. And I spend quite a lot of my time now teaching organizations and teaching MBA students what to do when you're facing a values conflict. If you're asked to do something that you think is mad, bad, or stupid, if you see something going wrong, most people will do nothing. And that's what allows the problems to grow. And that's how you end up with things like the Wells Fargo mis-selling scandal, or the Volkswagen emissions scandal, or the General Motors transmission scandal. Everybody knows, nobody says anything. Actually, if everybody raised those issues and concerns early, these things wouldn't happen. And the same goes for innovation, which is people often have ideas and they think, well, if I raise my idea, people might think I'm stupid or whatever. And then years later, people look back and think, how is it exactly that Microsoft missed the internet, that it didn't have a browser in production when Netscape went public? How is it that Google, ostensibly the smartest company in the universe, missed social networking? It isn't that people didn't know. It's that they didn't speak up.
I'm seeing some members joining us in this conversation. Robert says, disagreements can be good provided we are open to listening to the other person. Jose says, if I want to put myself in the other person's shoes, I need to take mine off first. That is a great thing to say, Jose. Yeah. I'm going to write that down. And Andrea, she has a question. She wants to know, there's a healthy disagreement and there's being aggressive at work. How do you handle an aggressive, bullyish type of personality?
Well, it's interesting. I have worked for bullies. And I was probably helped by having a bully as a father, which gave me early training. I think the really crucial thing is not to rise to the bait unless you absolutely have to, in which case you have to know that you're going to win. But I have definitely worked for bullies who really try to drive me into bad decisions. And in general, what I found was that usually they were doing that because they were frightened of something. If I could figure out what the source of the anxiety was and work around it, we could generally have a pretty cordial conversation. And a couple of things were key. One, if I was going to have an argument with him, never, ever, ever have it in front of other people, because then the stakes become too high if losing it is humiliating for him or for her. And the second thing I would always do is never push the argument to an absolutely firm conclusion. In other words, have the debate, have the discussion, and then say, let's think about it for a day or two and come to a conclusion. And almost invariably, when I did that, either at the next meeting or by an email, I would have won my argument. But it's quite important with bullies, I think, not to put them in a situation where they feel that they are visibly losing. They'll do almost anything to avoid that situation.
And Margaret, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is that I cover diversity in the workplace for LinkedIn, and your research has found that diverse teams actually disagree more. Why is that?
Well, because they're getting the benefit of diversity. Because, we've been working on diversity for so long. And I think a lot of kind of myths or misunderstanding have arisen. One is that if you have a really diverse team, it will naturally, have a huge amount of diversity in their thinking. Not necessarily. They may look diverse, but actually all have the same kind of educational background, or they may have all the same kind of core beliefs or very similar experiences. So I think partly you have to think about diversity on quite a deep level. And I think the other thing is, it's quite important, if you're finding that there's too much agreement, to start asking some provocative questions like, okay, so that plan's pretty good. But if we had half as much money, what would we do? Or if we had twice as much money, what would we do? If we had twice as much time, what would we do? To keep kind of stretching the idea and saying, can it go further? Is there something richer in here? Another great question is to just kind of take a devil's advocate position and say, okay, I'm just doing this as a test for the idea or for the proposal So let me argue this, just for the sake of testing where we are and see what happens. I do quite a lot of work with boards, and boards are often horrendously consensus driven, that they reach consensus too fast. They don't have a real discussion and exploration. And in those cases, really often the best thing to do is to assign different roles to the board members. So you're the customer, right? You're the finance, you're taking the finance position. You're the supplier's position. How does this play for you? What does it do for you? And what that often does is it gives people permission to have an argument that they might not naturally have.
I love that idea of bringing role playing into the boardroom or into the next meeting to kind of take the pressure away a little bit of having a disagreement. But Margaret, I personally am having just such a hard time disagreeing with colleagues during this time. And I wonder if there's a gender component to any of this. As a woman, I don't want to come off as a bully or aggressive. And I feel like it's so much harder to do that in this little square that we now work in. Does your research speak at all to any gender components on disagreement?
Well, it's interesting. The thing about, why people don't raise issues or concerns at work, there is no real gender difference. But I think you're onto something, in the sense that I think that men who will provoke arguments may be seen as kind of quite fierce or, quite brave, and women will typically be described as aggressive or strident. And this is just, good old fashioned stereotyping. I don't think that's a reason not to do it. I think that means that you have to be a little bit more careful. And I think you can say, and quite often should say, let's just try a thought experiment. If we were going to run this strategy past somebody who was, 25, what would they think about it? If we were going to run it past somebody who was 45, what would they think about it? If we were going to run this, offer this product to somebody who was from an ethnic minority, how would the marketing message sit? Just try to kind of put some different lenses on this as a reality check to how does it play. I mean, I know actually some companies that will have, I know this sounds absurd. I was amazed when I saw it happen. They'll have a doll in a chair that represents the customer. What's the customer thinking? Because the customer is usually in the boardroom, the unheard voice, right? Which is why you can have product launches that fall flat on their face, because everybody gets so excited by their own ideas. They forget this is a person, and at a certain price point, it's unacceptable. If you make it in a certain way in sweatshops or with certain ingredients, it's not going to fly. And you've got to do that perspective taking. And what you can't do, which is the trap everybody falls into, is thinking that your life experience is a universal life experience. Because the whole fun of being in an organization is theoretically groups of people make smarter decisions than individuals working on their own, but only if they really explore each other's experience and really start to identify what's the difference between us. That's what's interesting, not the stuff that's the same.
Absolutely. Putting a doll in a chair. I don't think that I've heard of that before.
It's bizarre, isn't it? It's bizarre.
I'm curious.
Bring in an actual customer.
I'm curious, as you've been advising teams and organizations through this pandemic, anything else weird or interesting that companies are doing right now, particularly given the remote nature of a lot of work?
Well, there are lots of things. I think what was really striking at the beginning was how instinctively most leaders recognized that they really had to look after their people. And on one hand, that it's so obvious, right? But for years, companies have fought remote working because they thought it was just a charter for slackers, right? For years, they thought, well, this would never work. And suddenly when they had to do it, A, they could. B, they found out that people were much more flexible and open to change than they'd ever dared test. And they discovered, and I'm amazed people were surprised, but they were surprised, that when you show you care about people and really give them some attention, they become much more productive. So I think that's been quite an eye-opener. I think the board meetings I sit in on now, conflict is very hard, and I have a huge concern that it's so hard to have a good debate online that there's some important debates not being had. And I have a third concern, which is I think everybody busted gut when lockdown started, and they had a lot of kind of adrenaline because it was an emergency. My observation now is people are getting really tired. They've had a lot of anxiety. They have been working really, really hard. They're scared of an economic crisis. They're scared of the climate crisis. And they just don't know what the world's going to look like when we get out of this. And that level of anxiety combined with the level of work, I think creates a huge risk of burnout. And it means it's more important than ever to look after each other.
And when you're tired and scared and exhausted, it's so hard to care for others. I actually want to bring up a quote from one of your recent TED Talks on this. You said, we have to resist the neurobiological drive to prefer most people like ourselves, and we have to seek out people with different backgrounds, different disciplines, and find ways to engage with them. That requires a lot of patience and a lot of energy that a lot of people don't have right now. You won't commit that kind of energy and time if you don't really care. Margaret, where are we going to find this energy right now?
Well, I think, I do a couple of things. I have a call sheet of people I really care about, not people I have to call, but want to call. And I do that pretty often. I started sending them postcards because often I didn't actually have much to say, but I thought, well, I'd like to send them something beautiful. And then they started sending me beautiful postcards back. And now I have this whole kind of pandemic diary, which is postcards. So I think thinking about what are the small things that give you joy, whether it's a walk, whether it's a postcard, whether it's, going to talk to your next door neighbor over the fence, whatever. Think about what are the things that sustain you and do as many of those as frequently as you can, because this really is a marathon. And I think understanding what boosts your mental health is going to be really crucial. And helping other people will make you feel better about yourself. I mean, when the pandemic started, I did this insane thing, which is my next door neighbor runs a farm and a farm shop and was saying, oh, if only he could do delivery. So I started doing deliveries for him. I mean, really, I did. And I ended up running a team of 10 drivers doing deliveries. And this was not really what I'd signed up for, but I kept doing it because it was a joy doing this task every day and being helpful to people. And it's amazing how when you help people, they're happy and that makes you feel better. So sometimes the way to get your energy is to help somebody else.
Absolutely. I received a postcard from a good friend just last month and it brought me to tears, which says a little too much about my mental health right now, but I agree. Just find the small things and try and do those as much as possible. Elizabeth says the most powerful opportunities have often come out of difficult time. And Kimberly says it's important to surround yourself with fellow optimists and positive people. Kimberly, you're definitely correct there. Margaret, I've learned so much from this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
My pleasure, and good luck to everybody watching.
That was Margaret Heffernan. She's the author of the new book, Uncharted. I want to go ahead and reveal the results of today's poll. I'm anxious to see where we netted out in terms of disagreements at work. It looks like a majority of you are saying, yes, it is more challenging. It's just like I said, people agreeing with me are Larry, Morella, Stephanie. Andrea says face-to-face is the best medium for resolving a conflict quickly. Body language and tone are everything. We have votes from Dolores and Cheryl saying, no, not at all. And then Martha, Carla, Manny, they say it depends, and Christina says it depends on the person and the problem. I want to thank everyone for voting on today's poll and joining us in the show. Tomorrow, we're going to have a very special show planned for you. We're going to be speaking with entertainers Jesus Nice and the Kid Marrow about entrepreneurship, taking risks, and their new book about life lessons from the Bronx. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thank you for watching LinkedIn News Live.